On November 18, 1944, at 0547 hours, the fog hung thick over Lorraine countryside in eastern France, and Staff Sergeant James Callahan sat in the commander's hatch of his M4A3 Sherman tank, staring at a piece of paper that might as well have been his death warrant. The orders were simple, typed in clean military precision, on a single sheet that smelled faintly of cigarette smoke and bad coffee. His platoon of 4 Sherman tanks was to establish a defensive position along the approaches to the village of Morange and delay an expected German counterattack. Intelligence estimated 6 to 8 Tiger tanks were moving up from the south, part of a desperate German push to break the American advance. The word delay was underlined twice. Not destroy, not engage, just delay. Everyone knew what that meant. It meant buy time with your life. It meant become speed bumps for 60 tons of German steel and fury. Callahan folded the paper carefully and tucked it into his jacket pocket, then looked at his crew. His gunner, Corporal Eddie Martinez from El Paso, was already loading the main gun with armor-piercing rounds that everyone knew would bounce off Tiger armor like pebbles off a castle wall. His driver, Private Tommy Chun from San Francisco, was running through pre-combat checks with the kind of methodical calm that came from accepting you probably wouldn't see sunset. His loader, Private Jake Morrison from Montana, was chain-smoking Lucky Strikes and hadn't said a word in 20 minutes. They all knew the math. In a straight fight, German Tigers killed American Shermans at a ratio of 5 to 1. The Tiger's 88mm gun could punch through a Sherman's armor at 2,000 yards, while the Sherman 75mm gun could barely scratch a Tiger's frontal plate, even at point-blank range. American tank crews had nicknamed the Sherman the Ronson after the cigarette lighter because it lit first time every time. For Shermans against 8 Tigers wasn't a battle. It was arithmetic. It was a massacre with a predetermined outcome. But Callahan had spent the last 3 weeks thinking about something he'd noticed during a maintenance incident. Something about the Sherman's transmission that no one else seemed to consider important. He'd been practicing a technique in his head, running through the mechanics of it during every quiet moment, sketching diagrams in the margins of his field manual. He hadn't told anyone about it yet, because it sounded insane. It violated every principle of armored warfare. It went against every instinct, every training manual, every tactical doctrine the Army had ever written. But as he watched the fog begin to lift and heard the distant rumble of heavy engines moving toward them from the south, Callahan made a decision. He keyed his radio and spoke 4 words to his platoon that would change everything. Listen up, we're fighting backwards. But what did he mean by fighting backwards? And why would anyone drive a 30-ton tank into combat in reverse gear? The answer lies in something the Germans never expected, and something that would turn 8 Tigers into burning wrecks by sunset. But first, Callahan had to convince his crew he wasn't crazy. On November 18, 1944, at 0612 hours, Corporal Martinez broke the stunned silence inside the Sherman with a single word that perfectly captured what everyone was thinking. What? Callahan knew he had about 2 minutes to explain the craziest tactical idea anyone had ever heard before his crew decided their tank commander had finally cracked under the pressure. He pulled out a grease pencil and started drawing on the inside of the turret wall, sketching quick diagrams while he talked. 3 weeks earlier, during a training exercise, his Sherman had thrown a track and had to be towed back to the maintenance depot. While the mechanics worked, Callahan had spent hours studying the transmission, and that's when he noticed something remarkable. The Sherman's reverse gear ratio was almost identical to its forward gear ratio. Most tanks reverse slowly because reverse was designed as emergency escape gear, but the Sherman could move backward at nearly the same speed it moved forward. That was unusual. That was interesting. But what made it potentially revolutionary was what it meant for combat tactics. When you drive a Sherman forward toward Tiger, you're doing exactly what the Tiger crew expects. They see you coming from 2,000 yards away. Their 88mm gun is already aimed at the exact spot where you'll be in 8 seconds. You're predictable. You're dead. You're a mathematical certainty on a German gunnery table. But what if you started the engagement already in position, already aimed, with your gun pointed at the killing ground, and then fought while moving backward? The gunner could fire while the tank reversed away from the enemy. The Tiger crew would have to continuously recalculate their firing solution because the target was getting farther away instead of closer. Every shot became harder instead of easier. And here was a key advantage that made Callahan's hands shake when he first realized it. You could duck behind cover instantly. The moment you fired, you reversed behind a hill or into a tree line, and by the time the Tiger rotated its turret and fired back, you were already gone. You became a ghost. A muzzle flash and then nothing. The Germans would be fighting an enemy that appeared, killed, and vanished over and over, and they would never get a clean shot because you were always moving away from them, always increasing the distance, always complicating their firing solution. Martinez stared at the greased pencil diagrams for a long moment, then looked up at Callahan with something between horror and respect. "Sarge, that's either genius or suicide, and I can't tell which." Chun, the driver, was already shaking his head. "You want me to drive backward into combat? Do you know how hard it is to drive this thing in reverse over rough terrain?" Callahan did know. He'd practiced it for 3 weeks in his head, and twice in actual training when no one was looking. It was hard. It required absolute trust between the tank commander and the driver, because the driver would be essentially blind, relying entirely on Callahan's directions. One mistake, one moment of miscommunication, and they'd back into a ditch or a crater and become a stationary target. But Morrison, the loader, surprised everyone by speaking for the first time that morning. "So we're already dead if we fight normal. This way, maybe we're not. I'm in." The decision was made. Callahan radioed his other 3 tank commanders and explained the plan. 2 of them thought he was insane. One of them, a sergeant named O'Brien, said he'd try it once and see what happened. That was enough. At 0638 hours, they positioned their 4 Shermans in a tree line overlooking a crossroads, guns pointed toward the killing ground, engines already running in reverse gear. The fog had completely lifted now, and in the distance, Callahan could hear them coming. The deep, guttural roar of Maybach engines, the screech of metal tracks on frozen ground. The Tigers were early, and there weren't 6 of them. Callahan counted the silhouettes emerging from a morning mist and felt his blood turn cold. There were 11 Tigers rolling toward his position, not 8, 11 of the most dangerous tanks ever built, and he had 4 Shermans and a tactic that had never been tested in actual combat. In 90 seconds, they would roll into his kill zone, and everything would depend on whether his crew could do the impossible, fight an entire battle while driving backward. But could 4 men really defeat 11 Tigers using nothing but reverse gear? Or had Callahan just invented the most elaborate way to die in armored combat history? On November 18, 1944, at 0641 hours, the first 3 Tigers rolled into Callahan's kill zone, and he realized with crystal clarity that the next 30 seconds would either prove his theory or turn his crew into a fireball. He gave him the signal, and the Sherman lurched backward into its prepositioned firing stance, gun already aimed at the lead Tiger's exposed flank. Martinez didn't need to be told. He'd been tracking the target for 5 seconds already. The main gun roared, and the armor-piercing round hit the lead Tiger just behind the turret ring, exactly where the side armor was thinnest. The penetration was clean. The Tiger shuddered. Smoke began pouring from its hatches, and before the German crew even understood what happened, Chin had already reversed them 20 yards back into the tree line. The Germans saw the muzzle flash. They saw their lead tank burning. But they had no idea where the shot had actually come from because by the time they looked, the Sherman was gone, invisible behind the trees, already repositioning for the next engagement. 15 seconds later, O'Brien's Sherman executed the same maneuver from a different position. Another Tiger. Another side shot. Another reversal into cover before the Germans could return fire. The German tank commanders were shouting into their radios now. Callahan could imagine confusion. They were trained to fight enemies who charged forward, who held ground, who behaved predictably. They had no tactical doctrine for an enemy that shot and immediately disappeared, that fought while retreating, that turned every engagement into a deadly game of hide and seek. The third Sherman got the third Tiger with a shot to the engine deck while reversing at full speed, the gunner compensating for the backward motion with practiced precision. 3 Tigers down in 90 seconds, and the Germans still didn't understand what they were fighting. But now the remaining 8 Tigers did what Tigers always did when ambushed. They attacked, aggressively, violently, with the kind of overwhelming force that had made them legendary. They spread out and advanced toward the tree line, turrets rotating, searching for targets, main guns ready to obliterate anything that moved. This was the moment Callahan had planned for. He'd pre-scouted 4 fallback positions, each one offering cover, each one providing a clear line of retreat, and most importantly, each one forcing the Tigers to expose their flanks as they pursued. The Shermans fell back to position too, still moving in reverse, still firing as they retreated. The Tigers chased them, and that's when the killing really began. Tiger number 4 caught a round while turning pursuit, the shell penetrating the thinner side armor. Tiger number 5 stopped to take a careful aim at what it thought was a stationary target, not realizing the Sherman was still moving backward, and Martinez put a round through its vision port. Tiger number 6 and 7 bunched up trying to flank from the left, and 2 Shermans caught them in a crossfire they never saw coming. The engagement had turned into something the Germans had never experienced before. They were fighting ghosts. Every time they acquired a target and prepared to fire, the target vanished. Every time they advanced to a new position, they exposed themselves to fire from an unexpected angle. They were the hunters. They had the superior tanks. They had the better guns and armor. But somehow they were being hunted. By 07:21 hours, 7 Tigers were burning or disabled, and the remaining 4 falling back in confusion and growing panic. Their company commander radioed that he was engaging multiple enemy positions and estimated 10 to 12 enemy tanks, using sophisticated hit-and-run tactics. He requested immediate air support and artillery. He had no idea he was fighting 4 Shermans. Just 4, and they weren't done yet. Callahan made a decision that even his own crew thought was insane. Instead of letting the Tigers withdraw, he ordered the pursuit. But here's where it got truly bizarre. He had Chin drive forward at full speed while keeping the main gun pointed backward. If the Tigers turned to fight, he could instantly shift into reverse and be back in firing position within seconds. The fleeing Germans saw a Sherman pursuing them and panicked. 2 Tigers tried to make a stand, turning to face their tormentor, but Callahan had already reversed back into firing position before their turrets finished rotating. Martinez and O'Brien's gunner caught both Tigers mid-turn. That left 2 Tigers running at full speed, one of which threw a track, trying to navigate rough terrain, while looking backward in panic. Morrison whooped as they added it to the tally. The final Tiger realized it was alone and that its entire company had been destroyed by an enemy it couldn't see and couldn't hit, did something unprecedented. Its commander popped the hatch, waved a white cloth, and surrendered. At 0809 hours, the shooting stopped. 11 Tigers destroyed or captured, for Sherman still operational. 0 American casualties. 0 hits taken. The impossible had happened. When Callahan's after-action report reached headquarters, the officers thought it was a lie. They thought he was covering up a disaster or inflating a minor skirmish. They sent investigators. They interviewed the crew. They examined the burned-out Tigers. And when they confirmed every word was true, they did something Callahan never expected. They classified the entire engagement and forbade him from ever teaching the technique to other crews. But why? Why would the Army bury the tactic that had just achieved an 11-0 kill ratio? The answer reveals something darker about warfare than anyone wants to admit. On November 22, 1944, at 1,430 hours, for days after the engagement, Staff Sergeant James Callahan sat across a desk from a colonel whose name he was never told and whose face he would spend the rest of his life trying to forget. The colonel had read the after-action report 17 times. He had interviewed every member of Callahan's crew separately. He had examined the wreckage of 11 German Tigers and confirmed every single kill. He had reviewed the radio intercepts from the German side, which revealed absolute chaos and confusion in their command structure. The tactic worked. It was proven. It was revolutionary. And then the colonel looked Callahan in the eye and told him he was never to speak of it again, never to write about it, never to teach it to another living soul. Callahan asked the obvious question. Why? The colonel's answer changed everything Callahan thought he understood about military strategy. The reverse fighting tactic required three things that most tank crews simply did not possess. First, it required a driver with exceptional skill and nerves of absolute steel, someone who could drive a 30-ton vehicle backward over rough terrain at high speed while essentially blind, relying entirely on the commander's directions. Second, it required a commander with perfect spatial awareness and the ability to pre-scout multiple fallback positions while under fire. Third, and most critically, it required a crew with such complete trust in each other that they could execute complex maneuvers without hesitation while people were actively trying to kill them. The colonel had done the math. Out of every 100 Sherman crews in the European theater, maybe 5 had all 3 requirements. Maybe 5. And here was the dark calculus that the Army had been forced to consider. If they made reverse fighting official doctrine and taught it to everyone, 95 crews out of every 100 would attempt it, fail catastrophically, and die even faster than they were already dying. They would back into ditches and become stationary targets. They would lose spatial awareness and reverse into each other. They would panic during the maneuver and freeze. The tactic that had saved Callahan's crew would become a death sentence for thousands of others. The Army couldn't officially teach something that would get most people killed, even if it made a select few invincible. So they made a different decision. They quietly identified a handful of crews who had the skills and temperament to pull it off. They taught them the technique in classified training sessions. They deployed them as specialized hunter-killer teams. And they never put it in any manual, never made it official doctrine, never acknowledged it existed. Callahan received the Silver Star in a ceremony where the citation carefully avoided mentioning what he had actually done. The medal talked about extraordinary heroism and tactical innovation, but never once mentioned reverse gear. His crew was quietly reassigned to special operations. Over the next 4 months, they killed 37 more German tanks using the same technique, and every single engagement was classified. Other crews who figured out the tactic on their own were handled the same way. Medal, reassignment, silence. By the time the war ended, maybe 20 crews in the entire U.S. Army knew the technique existed. It was never written down. It was never filmed. It was never included in the official histories. And when Callahan came home in 1945, he kept his promise. He never spoke about it. Not to his wife, not to his children, not to the historians who interviewed him decades later about his war service. He took the technique to his grave in 1982, and the Army's official position remained that it never existed. But here's what the colonel told Callahan that day in November 1944, the thing that made him understand why the silence was necessary. The colonel said that warfare is not about discovering the perfect tactic. It's about discovering the tactic that the most people can execute and survive. A technique that only works for 5% of your forces is not a doctrine. It's a lottery ticket. And the Army couldn't run a war on lottery tickets. They needed tactics that average crews could use to stay alive, even if those tactics were less effective than what a genius could accomplish. So they buried Callahan's method not because it didn't work, but because it worked too well for too few. They protected thousands of average crews by hiding a technique that would have killed them while saving a handful of exceptional ones. That's the answer to the question we asked at the beginning. The Army classified the reverse fighting technique not to keep it from the Germans, who had already experienced it and couldn't count it anyway, but to keep it from their own tank crews, who would have died trying to replicate it. James Callahan killed 11 Tigers in a single engagement using nothing but reverse gear and tactical genius, and the U.S. Army made sure almost nobody ever knew about it. Because sometimes the most dangerous knowledge isn't what the enemy can learn, it's what your own people can't. The Sherman tank that Callahan commanded that day in November 1944 still exists. It's in a private collection in Pennsylvania, restored to perfect condition, painted in historically accurate markings. But there's no plaque mentioning the 11 Tigers, no mention of the reverse fighting technique. Nothing that would tell you this particular tank changed armored warfare forever in a battle that officially never happened. And maybe that's exactly how it should be. Because the greatest victories aren't always the ones we celebrate. Sometimes they're the ones we bury to protect the people who come after us from trying to be heroes when they should just be trying to survive.